Welcome back to the Journal of Samuel Kelly. Last time Samuel took control of the Thetis ship, a ship that he had been on once before. He sailed to Santo Domingo with some cargo to sell. Due to conflict between the English and the French, Samuel and the crew were on a sharp lookout for French warships. Despite the danger, they arrived safely, but having little luck selling their supplies at Santo Domingo, Samuel decided to set sail for Kingston, Jamaica, where we find him now. Having procured 2 French mulatto women and a negress as passengers for Jamaica, we left this sickly, imposing place on the morning of the 17th of November, 1794. We experienced a strong breeze from the northward with a great swell of the sea. The 18th at meridian, Cape Rousseau, bore east 7 leagues. We got a sight of the mountain of Grand Ants in the island of Santo Domingo, which I think is higher land than any hill in Jamaica. In crossing the Bight of Legion, a schooner chased us. When she came near enough, we fired a shot at her, which caused her to haul to the eastward. The 19th we passed the island of Navassa in the forenoon, and at meridian got a sight of the Jamaica Mountains. On the morning of the 20th, near the east end of Jamaica, a Falmouth packet passed us for the windward passage. The night of the 20th we lay off and on near the White Horse Cliffs, and early in the morning received on board a Negro pilot belonging to Campbell and McEwen of Port Royal. For some time past, I had been troubled with a violent retching without discharging anything from my stomach, which our pilot perceiving, he requested me on arrival to get some green ginger and pound it, then boil it, using the decoction as tea, which advice I followed. The 22nd at 2 p.m., we entered Port Royal. The Siren sloop of war boarded us here and impressed 3 of my seamen, leaving me only the mate, the second mate, carpenter, and a lame sick man, besides the boys, 3 of which were thieves. About sunset, we arrived at Kingston. The 23rd of November, we moored the ship abreast of Prince Street and unbent our sails. Seeing a Liverpool ship near one of the wharves, I went on board to get some information from the master. I found by him that I was to come to a bad place for freights. Had I arrived a month sooner, I should have had a better chance. I found myself now surrounded by slave ships from Africa, the stench from which about daylight was intolerable, and the noise through the day very unpleasant. I therefore removed the ship to the windward and eastward of the nuisance. About a week after my arrival, my carpenter came to me in the evening and informed me that the lame man and the second mate, who also had a sore leg, were intending to leave the ship. I knew well it was useless to notice it, as I could not prevent them if they were so inclined. But on going on deck the next morning, I was not a little surprised at finding the boat had been carried off. Not only by the 2 men, but the carpenter was absconded also. I was now left with only my young mate and 4 small boys. As most of the ships in the harbor had the yellow fever on board, I contracted with an apocarthy to attend my mate and boys during our continuance in Kingston Harbor for £10, should they at any time be sick. Whichever way I looked now, my prospects were dreary and discouraging. The colors of different ships were almost daily hoisted in the morning, but it would have been much more prudent to have kept their losses secret and buried their dead in silence. I do not recollect going on board my ship without seeing the sick laying on the quarterdeck under the awning, and the Guinea ships particularly suffered by the fever, as many who had escaped the fevers on the African coast got ill on their arrival here, and several of their surgeons fell victims to this climate. I particularly noticed a fine, healthy, stout African captain one day playing billiards, but before the week ended, he was buried. About the middle of December, my 4 boys were attacked by the yellow fever, and I was obliged to hire a Negro named King to assist the mate and myself to attend on them. At last, I got lodgings for 2 of them on shore, and in a day or 2 after landing them, my stoutest boy, Ned, died. Having hired a ship's carpenter to make his coffin on board our vessel, I sent the mate and King to see him buried. When they returned from the funeral, the other boy, being convalescent and wishing to leave the lodgings, was brought on board, where he found his companions also recovering from their illness, and so little were they affected at losing Ned that they plundered his chest. I was sorry to find many articles in the deceased chest that he had plundered from the cabin. Amongst the rest was a bottle of bark from the medicine chest and the glass mustard pot, neither of which being of any service to him, shows that he was notorious for pilfering. I had taken off my chain and seals from my watch on leaving Liverpool to prevent their being injured by the bilge water, but could never find them afterwards. Probably they had been sold on shore to a Negro. 2 of the other boys I had chastised on the passage out for thieving from the cabin, I was now informed that the person who read the burial service at the boy's funeral was afraid to enter the burying ground, and therefore performed his duty, as it is called, without the gate. At the latter end of the week, when I paid King his wages, he refused taking any pay for the day he put Ned in his coffin and assisted in the burial. I inquired his reason for his generosity. He replied, "It was God Almighty's work, and I will have nothing for it." Will anyone say after reading this that Negroes are void of bowels of mercy and compassion? 'Tis probable this man was in the habit of attending on the Methodist preaching, or on the Black Baptist minister, Mr. Lyle, who had a meeting to the eastward of the town, at which place I have sometimes attended on the Sabbath, and had the pleasure, in company with 2 other shipmasters, of protecting his congregation from insult. We were standing at the door in the afternoon on Sunday when several young men, apparently clerks, approached the door, one of which was on horseback, and they had evidently been drinking to excess. The horsemen requested that they would make room for him to ride into the chapel, but finding us disposed to protect the assembly, they retired crestfallen. I saw some decent free blacks in the congregation, especially a family with second mourning gowns on the females. I observed that the men bowed to the minister on entering the chapel, and the women took off their shoes and curtsied. The singing was very bad, as few understood the words, but the service was conducted with the greatest order. I was informed that there was a trap door near the pulpit to retire by in case of any assault from the drunken white inhabitants, who are more frequently intoxicated on the Sabbath than on any other day in the week. Mr. Lyle appeared aged and was much beloved by the Negroes. I think he was by trade a mason in good credit, and had several students who preached occasionally, one of which I heard discoursing in a reasonable manner respecting death and its consequences. For the benefit of sociability, there were several ships in the same predicament as ours. 6 masters, including myself, entered into agreement to dine alternately with each other, which enabled us to live better than we could afford singly. This daily intercourse tended to keep up our spirits, but at times it had a different effect, there being so many people laying about the quarterdecks of one or other of the vessels. A new Lancaster ship was moored alongside of us, the master of which was a Quaker, and he lodged on shore. He sometimes came to visit his vessel whilst the crew was sick on board, and at last caught the disease, and in a few days after died on shore. His mate, being a diffident man, declined taking command. The second mate was therefore appointed, who, forgetting all decency, gave a drunken frolic to his acquaintances a few days after the Quaker master died. I was here informed that the ship Brothers, letter of marque, belonging to my owners, was condemned at Montego Bay. The newly appointed master, on his passage from New York, had run the vessel on shore on a reef near the Great Caicos, and had afterwards got her afloat and proceeded to Montego Bay, where she sunk. In the month of January 1795, several vessels sailed without convoy for different parts. Amongst the rest was the Jamaica for Liverpool, a constant trader. These ships were mostly captured by a privateer off the west end of Cuba, and a ship in ballast was given to their crews, who returned to Kingston in her. We could now see in calm mornings that the number of marine plants were growing on the ship's bottom very long, so that it would be impossible for her to beat to windward. As the ports in Jamaica were now open to Americans, the ships of that nation glutted the island with their produce. A brig belonging to Philadelphia, laying on our starboard bow, had just delivered her cargo and had received on board a few hogsheads of sugar, which her captain imagined was sufficient to stiffen her without striking his topgallant masts. The next morning, whilst my mate and myself were painting our ship, we observed the sea breeze advancing with rapidity, and as soon as it reached the American brig, she began to heel to the wind and continued laying down till her masts reached the water. She then stopped a little and afterwards turned bottom up, her royal masts being in the mud at the bottom of the harbor. She then blew at the cabin's windows, and when the air within was discharged, her masts returned to the surface, and she lay quietly afloat on her side. Our boat was dispatched to the assistance of her crew, and to pick up the floating articles ejected by the air from her cabin. Some time after, I saw her captain approaching his vessel, scratching his head, apparently in great distress. In the afternoon, the harbor master applied to me to permit the wreck to come alongside our ship, to endeavor to free her from water. But as our ship was nearly finished painting, I at first was unwilling, but my humanity overcame my carnal policy, and I agreed to admit her alongside and assist in raising her. Her anchor was therefore lifted, and she was hauled alongside, and I received her captain and crew on board my ship to accommodate them with lodgings, etc. The next morning, early, we got our derrick purchase on her mast and hove her upright, and our sloop hired for the purpose hauled alongside to assist in lifting her. Between the two vessels, we raised her main hatchway out of the water and then set the pumps to work, and some negroes hired bailed at the hatchway. When things were in a fair train, I left the ship on some business, and on my return found my mate and the captain as merry as grigs, quite at their ease, not troubling themselves to examine who was at work or who was at play. I soon roused them from their slumbers and pointed out to the captain where his attention was required, who was no more fit for a shipmaster than I was for an admiral. Towards night, she was well freed from the water, and I believe the next day, after striking her masts, she hauled from us, which I was not sorry for, as I much disliked my company. Some mornings at daylight we had a chance of obtaining mullets, which were caught in the following manner. When a fishing canoe discovered a shoal of these fish sporting on the surface, the negroes surrounded them with a net, the boat also having a perpendicular net spread lengthwise as a wall above the men's heads. The fishermen being now prepared made a noise with sticks on the boat's side, which made the fish leap out of the net in every direction. The fish that took the direction towards the fishing boat struck against the net hung up, and fell into the canoe. But all that took a different direction were lost to the fishermen, but many of them fell into the ship's boats that generally collected round the net. This bustle was a great treat to the boys from the ships. These mullets were about the size of a small mackerel, but I could not eat fish from the harbor with any satisfaction, as the slave ships were numerous around us. One day a message was sent me that an old friend of mine in the government would be glad to see me on board the Perseverance, Guineaman, of Bristol, just arrived from Africa and the Windward Islands. I accordingly paid him a visit. The female slaves appeared very cheerful and contented on board this vessel, far more so than what might have been expected from their situation. The merchants on shore were now much distressed for clerks, the mortality amongst them being very great, and the few remaining were obliged to work on the Sabbath. All white men and boys were required within 6 weeks after their landing in this island to enroll themselves in the militia. I often attended the parade ground where the town militia were embodied. The drum major was a black man, past the middle age, and wore a dark curled wig. He often made me smile by his strut and maneuvers. All the whites, except 2 companies of Jews, were obliged to find their regimental clothing, which cost a private about £10. The Jews were in rags and too poor to purchase clothes. They occupied a part of the parade ground distinct from those regularly accoutred. I sometimes visited the barrack yard of an evening to hear the remains of the band belonging to the regulars, who consisted of 4 musicians, the others having reached their long home. I found the inhabitants, in general, proud and licentious, and given to tippling and gaming, and many of the men in trade were void of honor and honesty, and most of the European clerks soon after arrival adopted these evil practices, which soon destroyed their health and brought many to an early grave. About the end of March 1795, as I could see no prospect of obtaining any early freight for to sail with the May fleet for Liverpool, I engaged to load at Old Harbor for London, and as soon as our top seams were very open, I hired some caulkers. I also got the ship heeled to scrape off the marine plants and shellfish from the bottom. The former were a foot long. A small boy having offered himself, I took him, but where to get a ship's crew I knew not, nor indeed could I find a single man but a few vile outcasts from the Spanish Main. About 2 days after my new mate came on board, on the 7th of April, being in a Jew's shop, I was taken very ill, and on leaving the house I repaired to Mr. Tinker's, the Applecarthys, who lived near, and he lent me his gig to carry me to the house of my friend, Mrs. M., who gave me a kind reception, and as I was not able to return to the ship, my messmate and friend, Captain Bird of the ship Mary of Liverpool, undertook to dispatch my ship for Old Harbor with the mate. 6 Spaniards were engaged to proceed in her and to continue by the ship 1 month, their wages being immediately advanced, their landlord giving security. My mate also shipped an Irish carpenter with a bad sore leg. On the 19th, my new mate's ill usage drove all the Spaniards and my 4 boys from the vessel. He was therefore obliged to hire negroes to load the ship. On the 23rd, I was informed of my loss, and as soon as possible I got my friend to persuade the Spaniards to return to the ship, and their landlord sent them by a boat. The boys were not to be found. When I got a little recovered, I went in search of the boys, and was informed by a friend that he had seen two of them on board the Rachel brig of Lancaster. During my illness, I was attended by Mr. Broughton, the partner of Mr. Tinker, whom I found to be a man of feeling and possessed of great abilities for his profession. At night, his negro was sent to apply a blister to my back, who ordered me a tumbler of cold water, which he requested I would drink at the time he stuck on the plaster. As I could not conceive the service of this water, I requested the doctor, when I next saw him, to explain its use, when he expressed his astonishment at the negro's conduct, and was much at a loss to account for his expected effects as myself, it being a mere whim of the servant. My wound was dressed with leaves from the Palma Christi tree which grew in Mrs. M's court, the house of my friend, M.G.N., belonging to a merchant, who was at this time with his lady in England. There was a large yard on the three sides of the house, in which were numerous offices. In the center of the largest piece of ground was a pond, in which, on pillars, a pigeon house was erected. Several trees and cotton bushes grew in the enclosure, in which a cow was also kept. A gig and 2 horses were also kept in the yard. 2 gentlemen boarded in the house, one of whom, when I began to recover, drove me in the gig at daylight before the sun was very warm, about 2 or 3 miles into the country, during which I visited the encampment at which I formerly, when a boy, sold my walking canes. These roads were so thronged at this early hour with invalids and convalescents, with pale faces and emaciated bodies, that a stranger, on entering the suburbs, would be apt to conclude that Kingston was a vast hospital. One morning the gig was lent to me, in which I was proceeding with the usual ride, when a light horseman stopped my career and gave me to understand that no person was permitted to leave the town that morning. I found that a strict search was being made by the militia to dispossess the French emigrants of their arms, as a rumor was in circulation that these refugees had it in their contemplation to encourage a revolt of the slaves. Between 200 and 300 warlike articles were secured, and many suspicious Frenchmen were sent to the British possessions in Santo Domingo. One morning I borrowed the harbor master's boat, and in her proceeded alongside the brig Rachel to demand my apprentices. The boys, having discovered my approach, jumped into the boat the opposite side of the vessel. As I perceived their intention, I called to them to come back, or I would severely punish them. They begged for mercy and returned. On questioning them about their desertion, they gave me a bad account of the mate's behavior, whose cruelty had forced them from the ship. Not being inclined to trust much to their promises, I tied them together with a cord and got them lodged in the workhouse till I could convey them to the ship. A day or two afterwards, I paid them a visit to see that they were not ill-treated, and found they were in good spirits and employed in picking oakum. One of my messmates, who had been taken by the French in January, was now ready to depart for Old Harbor in a prize ship. Accordingly, I embraced the opportunity, and having taken my boys from the workhouse, we sailed the 6th of May and arrived on board the Thetis the same day at noon. I found the sails still bent to the yards, my wine, etc., nearly exhausted, and things in general denoting the want of a careful manager. I found one of the casks of sugar stowed had a hole in its side, to which the negroes and Spaniards resorted, and I imagine from 1 to 2 or even 300 weight was missing, the slaves being very fond of drinking sugar and water, which I immediately put a stop to. We were now going on smartly in our lading, when my hopes of saving the convoy were quashed by the rain continuing to pour down with the greatest impetuosity during 2 days in succession. Our boats were filled alongside, and all hands were obliged to continue below deck. A current ran through the bay, carrying away with it trees and other floating substances. The roads were destroyed to a great distance, which were obliged to be repaired before any more sugar could come to the wharf. Just as the weather cleared, a young gentleman from Kingston made his appearance on board in borrowed clothes from the tavern, he having been overtaken with the rain after he left the town, and arrived at the bay like a drowned rat. His business was to solicit a gratis passage to England, as he said he could not pay for his passage, and he was afraid to stay any longer in such hazardous climate. I found he had visited Jamaica by the solicitations of a schoolmate who had got an estate left him in this island, and after taking possession had written to request his friend to quit England, and on his arrival in Jamaica he would do great things for him. Accordingly, the young man paid his passage out. But instead of being handsomely provided for, the estate owner had returned to Britain without making any kind of provision for his reception. He therefore accepted the situation of bookkeeper in the contractor's employ, for which he was previously qualified in a Jamaica merchant's counter in London. As I could not help feeling for his situation, I informed him that if he could lay out what money he could spare in provisions and would engage to pay £5 to the ship owners on his arrival in London, I would require no money for myself, but would take him with me. He therefore returned to Kingston rejoicing. The 16th of May, Providence sent me 3 seamen who had deserted from ships at Port Royal to obtain the run to England. On the 20th, 3 Swedish seamen came to the vessel and agreed to take the run. The convoy being appointed to sail the 28th of May, I was under the necessity of going to Kingston by land to clear the customs. I slept at the Bay Tavern, and early in the morning started in a gig with a Negro footman for Kingston. After proceeding about a half a mile, the horse would proceed no further, and for nearly a quarter of an hour we were baffled in all our attempts to urge him on. At last he started again. I found the bad effects of the late rain on the roads as we proceeded, but the country appeared in the highest state of beauty, and the dust having been washed off the trees and grass caused a great liveliness in the vegetation, and the many rivulets we met with had a cooling appearance. The grass was near a yard in length in some of the meadows, and I saw large herds of black cattle. But notwithstanding the luxuriance of the grass, they appeared lean and large-boned with wide spreading horns. I saw one ill-fated youth known by the name of a bookkeeper superintending a field gang of Negroes. I did not envy his employment under the rays of a burning sun. We arrived at Santiago de la Vega, or Spanish Town, about 9 o'clock, and remained there during the extreme heat of the day. But I was too feeble to walk about the place. I just walked to a house to receive the amount of a draft for hogsheads of coals sold at Old Harbor, and about 3 in the afternoon proceeded to Kingston. The next morning I went to the customs and got my business in a train for clearing. Having settled all my affairs, I took up my passenger about 3 in the afternoon, and finally quitted one of the most unwholesome, stinking places I had ever visited. We passed through Spanish Town about sunset, but found it impossible to reach Old Harbor, as the poorhouse was completely exhausted. We therefore stopped at a miserable tavern by the roadside for the night. Being much fatigued, I soon retired to my bed in a room honeycombed by the rats, and stinking abominably. During the night they made a great noise, and I slept uneasy. At daylight we proceeded on our journey to the Bay Tavern. After leaving our gig, I was walking across the court when I heard some dollars chink behind me, and looking round saw them laying on the ground. As I had 30 or 40 with me, I examined my pockets and found the rats had eaten through the outside pocket of my coat to get some crumbs of biscuits in the pocket. The morning of the 27th I joined my vessel, and to my great joy found all the coffee on board and ship in great forwardness for sailing the following morning. Having returned on shore, I waited at the tavern in expectation of seeing Dr. McKaylee from Old Harbor Township to pay me for some thousands of building bricks that I had sold to him, and on expressing my fears that he would not appear to a shipmaster who knew him well, he replied that he had no doubt but he would visit the bay in the course of the day, but he never came, and as he died soon after, the bricks were never paid for. This is a common trick in Jamaica. After our ship was unmoored and the longboat hoisted in, my crew came on shore to get a few necessary articles, and I promised them the same sum for their run home as was generally given by the fleet. Being short of provisions, I obtained here 2 barrels of beef without pickle. The fat was turned rusty and tasted like an old tallow candle, but I could obtain no other. My passenger laid in but a paltry sea store, but supposing he was governed by his circumstances, I was silent, though I had every reason afterwards to be well convinced that he had a considerable sum of money in his possessions, ungenerously secreted. Before I quit Jamaica, I wish to remark that if the magistrates of Kingston paid a little more attention to the welfare of the inhabitants, by employing the Negroes of the workhouse to remove or consume the accumulating masses of filth from the wharves and entrances of the streets and lanes next to the sea, it would doubtless increase the health of the people. It is well known that all the floating filth from Guineamen and other ships anchored before the town is driven on the beach and under the wharves the whole extent of Kingston, besides the filth of the land floods. The blood from the market slaughter wharf, quantities of putrid animal and vegetable substances, mixed with cartloads of straw, are constantly laying to windward of the town. Therefore, instead of getting a pure breeze from the sea, it is first tainted by the exhalations of this extensive putrid hotbed, which breeds and harbors myriads of common flies and other insects, And when I was a boy, a lurid flocks of vultures to prey on dead dogs, cats, etc., used to perch in rows on the fences adjoining the sea. To correct this evil in a great measure, I would recommend the workhouse Negroes to be employed in collecting all filth day by day, laying to windward of the town, and as soon as the land wind commences, consume it by fire, that the sparks and scent may be carried across the sea. This would be of great advantage to the inhabitants in general, especially to the merchants and their clerks, the whole length of Port Royal Street. The filth on the land side might be also consumed by fire during the continuance of the sea breezes. No salt fish or other articles liable to putrefaction should be stored to the eastward of the Wherry Wharf, and then all the mangy hogs would cease from rooting amongst the rubbish to the great annoyance of people on the wharves. The cattle should be slaughtered at the west end, and their blood and garbage buried under a penalty for neglect. Should these hints be acted upon with vigor and extended, I verily believe that sickly Kingston would be a very different place. I hope you enjoyed this episode from the Journal of Samuel Kelly. Please like, subscribe, and follow on whatever platform you're listening. Be sure to check out the description to see how you can support this project and others. And tune in next time for more from the Journal of Samuel Kelly.